November 2nd, 1847. Strokestown, County Roscommon, Ireland. When constables discovered the mutilated body of Major Denis Mahon in a drainage ditch 3 miles from his estate, their first assumption was highway robbery. But the precision of the wounds told a different story. 2 musket balls, fired from separate positions. Calculated, methodical. What disturbed investigators more, however, wasn't the assassination itself. It was what they found in the weeks that followed. Records of a weapon far more insidious than any firearm. A creature specifically trained to terrorize the starving, the desperate, and the dying. Major Mahon's estate manager, John Ross Mahon, kept detailed accounts. Hidden among rental ledgers and eviction notices, constables discovered feeding schedules, training logs, veterinary bills for wounds sustained during tenant encounters. The beast's name was never recorded in official documents. Estate workers called it an madra dub, the black dog. But the truth was far more terrifying than any local legend. Before we uncover the truth about the Strokestown Estate eviction bulldog and the reign of terror it enforced during Ireland's darkest hour, make sure to subscribe to Fear Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're documenting the forgotten horrors of history, the stories that official records tried to bury. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers scattered across the globe. Now, let's descend into the nightmare that was Strokestown Estate, 1847. Ireland, 1845 to 1852. The Great Famine, or as the Irish knew it, and Gorta more, gripped the island in a stranglehold of starvation and disease. What began as a potato blight transformed into systematic annihilation. 1 million dead, 2 million fled, a population devastated not merely by natural disaster, but by deliberate indifference. The British Empire, at the height of its power, watched Ireland starve while continuing to export grain, beef, and dairy from Irish ports. 40 shiploads of food left Ireland daily while corpses piled in ditches and workhouses overflowed with the dying. Strokestown, a market town in County Roscommon, sat at the epicenter of this catastrophe. The Strokestown Estate sprawled across 10,000 acres of prime agricultural land controlled by the Mahon family since the 17th century. By 1847, Major Denis Mahon had inherited an estate with 12,000 tenants, subsistence farmers who paid rent by working the land and growing crops they would never eat. The estate operated on the rundale system, where families subdivided plots into impossibly small holdings. A family of 8 might survive on half an acre, planting potatoes in raised beds called lazy beds. When the blight turned those potatoes to black putrid slime, there was nothing. No backup, no reserves. Only rent that came due regardless of crop failure. Major Mahon, educated at Eton and Oxford, viewed his Irish tenants through the lens of Victorian economic theory. They were inefficient, overpopulated, obstacles to agricultural modernization and profit. When the famine struck, he saw opportunity where others saw humanitarian crisis. But Mahon faced a problem. Under Irish law, landlords were responsible for paying poor relief taxes for tenants on holdings valued under £4 annually. The more impoverished tenants on his land, the higher his tax burden. Eviction became economically rational, morally unconscionable but profitable. The estate's architecture reflected this exploitation. Strokestown House, a Palladian mansion modeled after Austria's Schönbrunn Palace, featured a gallery overlooking the estate kitchen. From this elevated position, the landlord's wife could literally look down upon servants, dropping instructions through a brass grill without the indignity of direct conversation. This physical separation embodied the psychological distance between landlord and tenant. The Mahons didn't see people, they saw numbers on ledgers, expenses to be eliminated. But mass eviction presented practical challenges. Tenants, even starving ones, resisted. They clung to homes their families had occupied for generations. They pleaded, they wept, they fought back. Major Mahon needed enforcement, not just bailiffs and constables, but something more visceral, something that would break resistance before it formed. He found his solution in a dog. Estate records from March 1847 show a purchase from a breeder in County Meath. 1 male mastiff, 18 months, combat-trained, 47. An astronomical sum, equivalent to 2 years' rent for a small tenant. The transaction appeared in Mahon's personal accounts, separate from general estate expenses. Why the secrecy? Why the extraordinary cost? Witnesses would later describe a creature that seemed bred for one purpose, to transform eviction from administrative procedure into psychological warfare. Margaret Brennan, a widow with 4 children under age 10, received her eviction notice on April 3, 1847. Her husband had died the previous winter. Fever like thousands of others. Unable to work the fields or pay rent, she fell into arrears. When bailiff Thomas Kelly arrived with the crowbar brigade, men employed specifically to demolish the homes of evicted tenants, Margaret stood in her doorway and refused to leave. She held her youngest child, an infant of 8 months, and asked for mercy. Just another week to gather her belongings. Kelly whistled. From behind the demolition crew emerged an animal Margaret initially mistook for a small horse, black as midnight, shoulders level with a man's waist. The dog's head was massive, disproportionate even to its enormous body, with jowls that hung like curtains of flesh. Major Mahon's new estate manager, Kelly announced with a smirk. The dog didn't bark, it didn't growl. It simply stared at Margaret with yellow eyes that held no animal warmth, only cold assessment. Margaret fled. She grabbed what she could carry and ran with her children into the April rain. Behind her she heard the systematic destruction of her home, crowbars tearing thatch, stone walls toppling, her few possessions trampled into mud. The dog sat and watched, motionless, a black statue of enforced compliance. Father Michael McDermott recorded Margaret's testimony in the parish register. She says the creature was trained not to attack but to intimidate, to make resistance impossible through presence alone. She says its eyes held more cruelty than any man she'd ever encountered. Patrick Connor was not a man who fled. A blacksmith by trade, he'd built his cottage himself, stone by stone, over years of backbreaking labor. When his eviction notice arrived in May, he organized resistance. 15 families banded together, pledging to physically prevent the crowbar brigade from entering Connor's property. They armed themselves with tools, hammers, pikes, scythes. Not to attack, they insisted, but to deter. On May 17th, the confrontation began. Bailiff Kelly arrived with 8 men and the dog. The tenants formed a human chain across Connor's threshold. Patrick stood at the center, arms crossed, jaw set. "You'll have to kill us first," he declared. Kelly didn't argue. He simply released the dog's chain. What happened next entered local folklore, though accounts vary in details while agreeing on essentials. The mastiff charged, not at random, but with strategic precision. It targeted the weakest link in the human chain, an elderly man named Seamus O'Malley, 73 years old. The dog didn't bite. It drove its massive shoulder into O'Malley's midsection, knocking him backward into the mud. The chain broke. Then the dog turned to Patrick Connor, eye to eye, man to beast. The animal's breath, witnesses, described it as smelling of rotten meat, steamed in the May morning air. Patrick raised his hammer. The dog didn't flinch. It simply opened its jaws, slowly, deliberately, revealing teeth the length of a man. A rope of saliva dripped onto Patrick's boot. From behind the dog, Kelly's voice. "Your choice, Connor. Leave now, or see what Major Mahon's investment can truly do." Patrick lowered his hammer. The resistance collapsed. Within an hour, Connor's cottage was rubble. But the incident established a pattern. The dog never actually attacked. It didn't need to. Its presence, its sheer physical dominance combined with obvious capacity for violence, broke human will more effectively than any weapon. Not all encounters were during formal evictions. The dog patrolled. Mary O'Neill, age 7, was gleaning in a recently harvested wheat field on June 23rd. Gleaning, the practice of collecting leftover grain after the harvest, was technically legal, though Major Mahon discouraged it. His grain was for export, not for feeding starving locals. Mary was alone, filling her apron with scattered wheat kernels when she heard panting behind her. The dog had approached in complete silence. It stood 15 feet away, watching her with that same cold assessment witnesses repeatedly described. Mary froze. She was a child who'd grown up hearing stories of wolves in the hills, of dangers in the dark. But this was different. This creature watched her with something beyond animal hunger. It was evaluating, calculating. She dropped her apron. Wheat scattered across the stubble. The dog stepped forward. Mary stepped back. This dance continued for what she later estimated as 10 minutes, though terror distorts time. The dog herding her, step by step, away from the field and toward the estate road. Never touching her, never barking. Simply advancing whenever she paused, stopping whenever she retreated. By the time she reached the road, she was sobbing. The dog sat down at the field's edge and watched her run home. Father McDermott's notes. The child says the dog smiled at her. I tell her dogs cannot smile, but she insists. She says it knew exactly what it was doing, that it enjoyed her fear. The most disturbing accounts emerged from nighttime incidents. The dog, witnesses claimed, would appear at cabin windows after dark, just standing there, breathing against the glass, fogging it with condensation. Families already on eviction notice reported waking to find the dog's silhouette blocking their doorways. They'd peer through gaps in their walls. Most tenant cottages had cracks that admitted wind and rain, to see yellow eyes reflecting firelight. Dennis Flannery, a tenant farmer with 6 children, documented his experience in a letter to his brother, in America. The creature visits nightly now. It does nothing but watch. We cannot sleep. The children weep at the sight of it. Yesterday I found its massive paw prints in the mud outside our window. 3-day-old prints, mind you, yet still perfectly preserved, as if the earth itself fears to disturb the marks of such a beast. We leave next week for Liverpool. The passage is paid by Major Mahon. He calls it charity, but I know it is banishment. Better exile than another night under that devil's gaze. This reveals Mahon's complete strategy. The dog didn't just enforce evictions, it made staying psychologically impossible. Tenants would accept assisted emigration. Mahon's program shipping evicted families to Canada in disease-ridden coffin ships, rather than endure the animal's presence. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten history. Let's discover what happens next in the nightmare that consumed Strokestown Estate, November 2, 1847. The gunshots that killed Major Denis Mahon echoed across more than a physical landscape. They reverberated through Ireland's festering wound of colonial brutality and organized resistance. Constable William Armstrong arrived at the scene within an hour of the shooting. His official report, preserved in the National Archives in Dublin, provides clinical detail. The deceased was discovered face down in a drainage culvert approximately 3 miles northeast of Strokestown House. 2 entry wounds observed, one through the upper back, penetrating the right lung, one through the left temple. Powder burns on the temple wound suggest close-range discharge. Blood spatter patterns indicate the victim was standing when the first shot struck, then executed with the second while incapacitated. Premeditated assassination, not random violence. The murder sent shockwaves through the Anglo-Irish landlord class. If Mahon, a major with military training and significant resources, could be killed so publicly, no landlord was safe. But what investigators discovered in the following weeks revealed something far more systematic than a revenge killing. When constables searched Strokestown House, they found John Ross Mahon's private study locked. Inside the desk, documents that painted a complete picture of the estate's reign of terror. A leather-bound journal detailed the dog's training regimen. Entries in John Ross Mahon's handwriting. March 14th, subject shows promising aggression toward targets wearing ragged clothing. Increased food reward by half-pound beef per successful intimidation. April 2nd, introduced scent training. Subject now associates peat smoke and unwashed wool tenant markers with work command. Response time improved significantly. May 20th, subject demonstrates understanding of crowd control tactics, capable of isolating specific individuals from groups without physical contact. Exceptional results. The journal contained 47 entries over 8 months. Each one documented behavioral conditioning designed to create a living weapon of psychological warfare. Bills from Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, a veterinarian from Longford, revealed the dog sustained injuries 13 times between April and October 1847. The nature of these injuries was telling. Multiple contusions to skull and muzzle, consistent with impact from thrown stones, laceration to right foreleg, likely from farm implement. Broken canine tooth, appears deliberate rather than accidental. These weren't injuries from aggressive attacks. They were defensive wounds, evidence that desperate people had fought back against the dog when it appeared at their homes. The bills totaled 23, more money than most tenant families saw in 5 years. Letters between Major Mahon and other landlords revealed he'd marketed the dog strategy as a solution to the tenant problem. Lord Lucan in County Mayo, your method intrigues me. The use of an animal removes moral complexity from the eviction process. One cannot negotiate with a dog, nor can tenants appeal to its conscience. How might I acquire similar enforcement? Lord Clarendon, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, while I cannot officially endorse such tactics, I acknowledge their efficiency. The Empire requires firm management of Irish properties. Continue as you see fit. But the most chilling document was Major Mahon's response to a question from Lord Lansdowne about whether the dog had ever actually harmed anyone. Mahon wrote, "The brilliance of the strategy is precisely that it need not. Fear is self-sustaining. The dog's reputation now exceeds its actual capacity. Tenants evacuate at the mere rumor of its approach. I've reduced eviction costs by 60% while tripling the pace of clearances. The beast has paid for itself tenfold. What happened to the dog after Mahon's assassination remained unclear until a stable hand named Thomas Brennan, no relation to the widow Margaret, provided testimony under immunity. Brennan revealed that on the night of November 2nd, immediately after news of the murder reached Strokestown House, estate manager John Ross Mahon ordered the dog destroyed. He didn't want the creature alive to be associated with the Major's death, Brennan testified. Said it would complicate the narrative. He made me lead it into the woods and shoot it. But when I raised the rifle, the dog just sat there, staring at me. Like it knew, like it understood this was the end. I couldn't do it with it looking at me like that. I fired 3 shots into the air and told Mr. Mahon it was done. I left the dog chained to a tree, figuring it would starve or someone would find it. When I went back 2 days later to check, the chain was broken. Clean break, like it had been cut. The dog was gone, never saw it again. Brennan's testimony was never made public. The authorities buried it in sealed files, likely because it raised uncomfortable questions. Who released the dog? The Famine wrote in 1882, "The landlord's dog was trained to see us as less than human, but that dog was merely the visible manifestation of a system that viewed the Irish as obstacles to profit." Mahon's method was unique only in its honesty. He made explicit what others disguised with legal paperwork and economic theory. The tenants who'd survived evictions scattered across the globe. In America, Canada, and Australia, Irish immigrants told stories of the Black Dog of Strokestown, transforming specific historical horror into cautionary folklore. After Major Mahon's death, the Strokestown Estate passed through several owners. Each struggled with the property's dark reputation. Tenants were increasingly difficult to find. Workers refused positions at the estate house. By 1870, large sections of the property lay fallow, economically worthless despite fertile soil. The house itself fell into disrepair. In 1979, Jim Callery purchased Strokestown House and discovered a sealed archive in the basement. Inside, estate records dating back to 1740, including documents from the famine period. This discovery transformed historical understanding of the Great Famine. Among those documents were fragments of the dog training ledger, not the complete journal discovered by constables in 1847, but entries torn out and hidden separately. Why John Ross Mahon preserved these specific pages remains unknown. Strokestown House is now a museum. The Famine Museum on the estate grounds tells the story of systemic eviction and engineered starvation. But even there, references to the dog remain vague. Museum guides mention intimidation tactics and psychological warfare without detailing specifics. The full horror, the deliberate breeding and training of an animal to terrorize the starving, remains too disturbing for public consumption. Mahon's assassination achieved nothing in immediate legal terms. The evictions continued. Other landlords adopted similar tactics, though most were subtler about documentation. But in the longer arc of history, Strokestown became a catalyst. The brutality was too extreme to ignore, even for British officials who'd rationalized mass starvation as economic necessity. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849, passed partly in response to the Strokestown scandal, forced the sale of bankrupt estates like the Mahons. The hope was that new owners would be less brutal, more invested in sustainable management. That hope proved naive. The new owners were often speculators, English and Scottish businessmen seeking profit, not reform. Evictions accelerated. It would take another 70 years and a war of independence before Irish land rights were meaningfully addressed. Contemporary historians have reassessed the Great Famine as genocide, not passive policy failure but active elimination of an inconvenient population. Dr. Francis Costello, in his 2018 book The Irish Holocaust, includes a chapter on Strokestown. The dog represents the culmination of dehumanization. Mahon didn't see his tenants as human beings deserving mercy. He saw them as logistical problems requiring efficient solutions. The dog was that solution, a biological weapon deployed against unarmed civilians. When Strokestown Famine Museum commissioned research into the dog's fate, they uncovered persistent local legends. Farmers in Roscommon reported sightings of an unusually large black dog well into the 1860s, always at dusk, always near former Mahon estate properties. One account from 1859, documented in a local newspaper, described a black mastiff appearing at the new Strokestown landlord's window during a tenant meeting. The landlord allegedly fled the property that night and never returned. Folklore? Almost certainly. But folklore preserves emotional truth when official history fails. The Strokestown eviction dog was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systematic dehumanization that characterized imperial expansion worldwide. The British Empire had a Dockham, entered history of using animals as instruments of control. In India, elephants were used to execute prisoners through crushing. In Australia, dogs were employed to track Aboriginal people during frontier violence. In the Caribbean, dogs were used to terrorize enslaved populations and prevent escape. What made the Strokestown case unique was the precision of the psychological warfare. This wasn't random violence or punishment for transgression. It was preemptive terrorization designed to break resistance before it formed. Dr. Christina Sharp, in her work on anti-black violence, coined the term the weather, the pervasive atmosphere of terror that doesn't require constant violent acts to be effective. Once established, the mere possibility of violence constrains behavior. The Strokestown dog was weather. Its reputation did more work than its actual presence. Tenants evacuated at rumors of its approach. Families accepted exile rather than risk confrontation. This strategy has been replicated worldwide. American police departments' use of canine units in black and brown communities, where dogs are presented not as safety tools, but as visible threats. Immigration enforcement's use of dogs at detention facilities, creating psychological intimidation beyond physical security, needs authoritarian regimes' public deployment of attack dogs at protests. Where the visible potential for violence suppresses dissent, the underlying principle remains constant, using creatures perceived as inherently dangerous to make resistance psychologically impossible. Major Mahon's strategy reveals how economic systems justify extraordinary cruelty through abstraction. He didn't evict tenants because he hated Irish people, though prejudice certainly played a role. He evicted them because they represented tax burdens and obstacles to agricultural modernization. The violence was rationalized as economic efficiency. Contemporary parallels abound. Mass evictions framed as urban renewal that displaces low-income communities, foreclosures presented as necessary market corrections that destroy family stability, immigration enforcement separating families in the name of border security. In each case, individual human suffering is subordinated to systemic goals. The violence isn't personal, it's procedural. And procedural violence is easier to defend, easier to normalize. The dog made this explicit. It was a tool, an investment, a line item in accounting ledgers. That its work involved terrorizing children and starving families was beside the point. It was efficient. It was profitable. James Hastie and Michael Morris were hanged for allegedly murdering Major Mahon. They may have been guilty. They may have been scapegoats. The evidence was never conclusive. But consider the asymmetry of justice. Mahon orchestrated the displacement of thousands. He implemented strategies that directly led to death through exposure, starvation, and disease. Conservative estimates suggest his eviction campaigns contributed to at least 400 deaths, more than any single murderer in Irish history. He was never charged with any crime. His actions were legal, protected by property law and imperial authority. The men accused of killing him were executed within 6 months of arrest. This pattern, where systemic violence is legal and resistance to it is criminalized, defines much of human history. The Strokestown case simply makes it unusually visible. The Irish diaspora carries Strokestown's legacy. Descendants of evicted tenants live across the world: America, Canada, Australia, Britain. Many don't know specific details of their ancestors' displacement, but they carry a generalized understanding that they exist elsewhere because Ireland became impossible. This is intergenerational trauma, the kind that doesn't require direct experience to be felt. Modern Roscommon residents report discomfort near the Strokestown Estate boundaries, not because they've had personal negative experiences, but because place itself carries memory. The land remembers what happened there. Indigenous scholars call this land-based trauma, the way geographical spaces retain histories of violence that affect people generations later. Can systems built on such violence be reformed, or must they be completely dismantled and rebuilt? The Strokestown Estate eventually became a museum dedicated to documenting the very horrors it once perpetrated. Is this redemption, or is it the ultimate appropriation? Profiting from educational tourism about suffering the institution itself caused? These questions remain unresolved. Strokestown House generates revenue from visitors who come to witness rooms where eviction orders were signed. The gift shop sells books about the famine. Is this bearing witness, or is it commodifying trauma? Perhaps the most disturbing implication of the Strokestown dog is what it reveals about human capacity for moral compartmentalization. The men who trained the dog likely thought themselves decent. John Ross Mahon probably attended church, was kind to his family, had friends who respected him. But he could also meticulously document strategies for terrorizing children. He could write successful intimidation in a ledger next to budget figures and feel satisfaction at efficiency achieved. This is the banality of evil Hannah Arendt described. the ability to commit atrocity while perceiving oneself as merely doing a job. The dog's trainer didn't see himself as evil, he saw himself as solving a problem. That the problem involved human beings whose lives he was destroying didn't penetrate his moral awareness. We like to think we'd be different, that we'd recognize evil and resist it. But Strokestown suggests otherwise. Most evil is perpetrated by people who believe they're being reasonable, practical, efficient. The question isn't whether we'd resist obvious cartoon villainy, it's whether we'd recognize systemic violence when it's presented to us as economic necessity, bureaucratic procedure, or professional responsibility. What drove Major Denis Mahon and his estate manager to such calculated cruelty? Was it pure economic greed, colonial prejudice against Irish people, or something deeper? A fundamental failure of empathy that allowed them to see human beings as spreadsheet entries? Leave your theories in the comments below. And tell us, have you encountered modern parallels to this kind of systematic psychological violence? Where do you see echoes of Strokestown's horror in today's world? If this story moved you, subscribe to Fear Abbey for more lost chapters of history, the dark truths that official records tried to bury. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a descent into humanity's forgotten nightmares. The dog may be gone, but the systems that created it remain. Understanding the past is the first step toward preventing its repetition. See you in the next video. Until then, stay vigilant. History's horrors have a way of recurring when we stop paying attention.